Thank you very much, Professor Rim, for this excellent overview of the alcohol question. And now I am going to discuss French paradox. The French paradox is a kind of illustration of the alcohol problem. And the story began in the 90s when we published in the Lancet in 1992 a paper where we analyzed the relationship between alcohol drinking and platelet and the risk of thrombotic complication. It was the first time scientists proposed an explanation of the French paradox. I will explain what is the French paradox. And this paper was cited 1,000 times in Google Scholar since the publication. What is the French paradox? Along the horizontal axis, you have diet fat or saturated fat or animal fat, as you like, or you can put also cholesterol level, it is the same thing. And here, along the vertical axis, you have coronary heart disease mortality. And as you can see, there is a linear relationship between the two parameters, but there are some exceptions. For instance, Switzerland or France and UK. This analysis takes into account all the usual risk factors for coronary heart disease, means age, body mass index, smoking, diabetes, and so on. It means that this is a paradox because, for instance, for UK and France, for the same cholesterol, the same saturated fat intake, you have a very large difference in coronary heart disease mortality. For unknown reason, this paradox has been called French paradox, but it was possible to say UK or British paradox or Swiss paradox. I don't know why the scientists decided to use French paradox, but not the French investigators called this paradox French. Now, there are other scientists using the same kind of analysis, and they put along the x-axis cholesterol, saturated fat, and they found the same kind of relation with two exceptions, France and Finland. This is another way of defining the French paradox. But it is important to understand that there is a paradox only if we accept the theory that saturated fat or blood cholesterol are causal factors of cardiovascular disease. If cholesterol is innocent, if saturated fat are innocent, there is no paradox. It means we can explain coronary heart disease by other factors. As you know, there is endless controversy regarding the causality of saturated fat in cardiovascular disease. This is a recent meta-analysis published in 2010. You can see the authors concluded that there is no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with coronary heart disease. Well, regarding cholesterol and statins, also there is an endless controversy. This is a book I recently published in English. If you are interested by the issue, if you want to know why there is a controversy and why statins don't save lives, and how pharma-funded research deliberately by the studies, read that book. But more and more people are thinking that definitely cholesterol is innocent and statins are not effective, but toxic. Well, if we still accept that cholesterol and saturated fat are important factors in coronary heart disease, there is a French paradox, and we must try explain. But recently, over the last 40 years, there have been a striking decline in coronary heart disease mortality in most countries, in most developed countries. Just give one example. This is the United States, and you can see that since the peak of the 70s, there is a striking decline in coronary heart cardiovascular disease mortality. There are various explanations for that. For instance, development of coronary arteriography or coronary care unit or coronary angioplasty or the use of aspirin. But in fact, all these explanations are not good, in my opinion. Probably lifestyle change are the more important factors. Now, the question is, whatever the explanation about the striking decline in coronary heart disease and cardiovascular disease mortality, possibly different in different countries, the question is, for me today, is the French paradox still existing? Now, these are recent data from the European Heart Association, and it is an update on regional variation. This is a map showing the different countries, and this is a color scale regarding the rates. This dark green, low mortality rate for coronary heart disease, and red, this high mortality rate. You can see that France, paradoxically, curiously, is different from the other countries, including Mediterranean countries, including Greece. This is for men and coronary heart disease deaths. Here it is for stroke deaths. Again, France is completely different of the other countries. This is again for men, and this is for women. You see that there is no north to south gradient for either cardiovascular, ischemic heart disease or stroke. And you see that Greece, it was a symbol of the Mediterranean diet and low coronary heart disease mortality in the 60s and 70s. And now the difference with the other countries is not in the good trend. And also for Portugal, for stroke, it is higher than in Norway. Well, come back to the French paradox, there are many explanations proposed by very famous scientists. First, for instance, that the death certificates may have been wrong in France, or that the French statisticians are not able to make addition or any calculation, or there is a normal north to south gradient. But these explanations are not right. Two other explanations are more interesting. First, is France a Mediterranean country, or are French protected because they have adopted a Mediterranean diet, for instance, or the wine drinking hypothesis? Now, regarding the theory that the Mediterranean diet is protective, I think that all the people in that room agree that yes, it is definitely protective. Well, next question, are the French Mediterranean? Well, if you look at the geography, it is obvious that the French are not Mediterranean. The Parisians are close to London, not close to Roma or to Sardinia. And the latitude is very important because the climate depends on the latitudes, and the agricultures depend on the climate. This is France. As you can see, most of the French territory is under the influence of the Atlantic climate or the continental climate or alpine climate, and only a small portion of France is under the influence of the Mediterranean climate. I put here Paris, Poitou-Charentes, I will tell you why, and Montpellier, which is in the south of France. And now we can look at the mortality rate from coronary heart disease in the different population in the French regions. You see that the lowest mortality rate from coronary in France is in Poitou-Charentes. It is not in the south, it is along the western coast, along the Atlantic Ocean. Now, Paris and Languedoc is exactly the same thing, despite a long distance, 1,000 kilometers. Definitely, we don't have a north to south gradient to explain the French paradox. Now, the hypothesis of the French are protected because they have adopted a Mediterranean diet, came to the idea for many scientists and physicians, the people, that the French paradox and the Mediterranean diet is the same thing. I encourage you to read that paper. It was an invitation from the European Heart Society to try to explain the difference between the two concepts. This is very important. Now, back to the French paradox, according to a very simple graph, simplistic graph. But it is interesting to see that without adjustment, France and UK are very far from the correlation line. But if you adjust for wine drinking, you can see that France is along the line, Switzerland is along the line, and UK is very close to the line. It means that the wine drinking may partly explain the French paradox or the British or the Swiss paradox. Now, I confess that it is a very simplistic explanation, but it is an illustration that there are many factors playing a role in the effect of wine or ethanol in the French paradox or in the prevalence of coronary heart disease. Now, after publishing that paper, so many scientists tried to explain the effect of wine and ethanol on cardiovascular disease. But there are two very important questions. The first one is, are saturated fat and cholesterol really causal factors? I will not discuss that. And the second one is, what are the biological effects of wine, which could explain this effect? Professor Rim proposed some explanation, but there are some other I prefer. For instance, the effect of ethanol on platelet function. As you know, platelets are very important in cardiovascular complication, and cardiologists and other doctors give aspirin or Plavix or antiplatelet drug, and definitely these drugs are active. Well, we have many studies showing the importance of ethanol on platelet function or platelet aggregation. It is an effect like aspirin, but we have to take care with that. This is a paper, a study conducted in rats. There are 4 groups. The control group with water, first group with alcohol, second with red wine, and third with white wine. This is platelet aggregation, and you can see that when you give ethanol to the rats, there is a striking decrease in platelet aggregation, whatever the way of giving ethanol. But if you stop giving ethanol to the rats and you measure platelet aggregation 1 day later, you can see this is a control group. This is 100%. This is the same different scale from here. And you can see that there is a rebound effect. You stop drinking, and you have an increase in platelet aggregation, in the thrombotic risk. But if you take red wine, you don't have the rebound effect. with the white wine, you have some rebound effect. It means that can explain what we call the holiday heart. There's a cardiac death occurring 1 day or 2 days after an episode of binge drinking, and usually it is an acute ischemic event or a cardiac arrhythmia following an ischemic event. Now, is wine more protective than other ethanol beverage? I think we don't have the data to decide if it is different or not, because the wine drinkers and the beer drinkers are completely different. The way of drinking wine and the way of drinking beer or spirits are completely different too. My opinion is it is too complex to make a difference between wine and beer. Now, this is a paper, a very interesting paper, recently published in the British Medical Journal, comparing drinkers or non-drinkers in France and in Ireland. Just I indicate here the conclusion of the authors. They say the prevalence of binge drinking, which doubles the risk of ischemic heart disease compared with regular chronic drinking, was almost 20 times higher in Ireland than in the French centers. Never drinkers, we were 7 times more numerous in Ireland. In Belfast, it is a city of Ireland, at the risk of ischemic heart disease similar to that of those using binge drinking. You see, this is so complex to compare the different way of drinking and the different drinkers. But definitely, binge drinking is not good. But if you compare the French and the Irish population, in fact, the Irish drink much less than the French. But they are not protected. But they are binge drinkers. Well, after myocardial infarction, definitely it is a very good idea to drink wine. You are, whatever the way of eating, if you drink wine after myocardial infarction, the risk of recurrence is significantly reduced, and most cardiologists in France or in Europe in general, I think, recommend to their patient after myocardial infarction to drink a glass of wine after myocardial infarction. Now, excuse me. The next question is, you know the answers, of course. What is wine? Wine is just a mix of ethanol and polyphenol. All the other substances in wine are in so small amounts, it's not important. But if polyphenol are important, the question is, if I give polyphenol without ethanol, is there any effect? But there is another beverage which is very rich in polyphenol without ethanol. It is tea. Tea is just water plus polyphenol. There are many observational studies showing that drinking tea is very good for the prognostic of cardiovascular disease. There is a significant reduction of the risk. Now, regarding the mechanisms, I told you that ethanol reduces platelet aggregation and the risk of thrombotic complication, but polyphenol. There are many biological properties of polyphenol, but I have selected 2. The one here is about endothelin. Endothelin is described as a highly potent vasoconstrictor, and its overproduction is seen as a key factor in the development of cardiovascular disease. But when you give red wine, there is a significant reduction of endothelin production. This is a very good news. And now there is another explanation. Polyphenol increase the omega-3 fatty acid in the blood. This has been shown in humans in a small study among patients with coronary heart disease, but also in a large epidemiological study. And finally, we have been able to reproduce the phenomenon in rats. You give some anthocyanin to rats, and you see the omega-3, the long-chain omega-3 fatty acid increased by about 30%. Now, is wine drinking the only possible explanation of the French paradox? I don't think so. I think that wine drinking, as Professor said, is just a parameter in a healthy lifestyle. And at present, the French, as you know, are very resistant to the change. They are very traditional. And one thing they continue to do is to have family meals. Most French do have 2 or 3 family meals every day. And this is a very important societal aspect. Of course, it's just an illustration of the phenomenon. You can see on this slide that there is no wine bottle, but there are children around the table. And this is, you know, in most European populations, there are more and more snacks that people eat at any time of the day. But the French continue to have their family meals in the morning and at the evening at minimum. But for me personally, I have 3 family meals every day: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Well, we know there are many centenarians in Okinawa, but we have also centenarians in France, and they drink wine. Well, if you need more discussion, this is just an illustration of a very complex problem. If you need more discussion, you can read our publication about the problem, or you can, if you read French, go to my blog. There is the address of the blog here. And I thank you very much for your attention.